Dr. Engelhardt, old friends, new friends, I want to tell you what a delightful experience it is to be back in Indiana, particularly at this time of year. I think I didn't realize how homesick I was for Indiana until I saw this redbud around. We don't see much of that in Chicago and the North Shore area, but it's a wonderful experience to be back home again. The news and the techniques of reporting it has become so much a part of the American scene that almost everyone is familiar with the 5 W's and the H: the who, what, when, where, why, and how. These elements were once regarded as absolutely essential to the opening paragraph of all news stories. Although journalists have recently taken a more liberal view of where these questions are answered, the 5 W's and the H are still basic to good news story structure. Now this morning, may I use the 5 W's and the H in a little different way. I should like to use them as a basis for asking you 6 questions. 6 questions which I think stand for 6 of the most sensational, most significant, and most controversial news stories of our time. I believe that more than half of what you're reading and hearing and seeing is closely related in one way or another to the answers to these questions. I wish I had the answers too, but I don't. I have some ideas on each of them, and I hope you do too, for our answers to these questions may determine how and for how long we live, individually and as a free society in these United States. Let's begin with how. The complete question, as I have formulated it, is how shall we be educated? As students, teachers, citizens, taxpayers, we have increasing interest in this question. And students, above all, have a personal stake in how it is answered. Tomorrow, today's students will be helping to answer it in their PTA meetings and school board meetings, and perhaps even at the ballot box. Today, this question, I think, is page 1 news, and mostly because the Russians sent Sputnik orbiting into space before we did. And although our defense officials first minimized this accomplishment, the subsequent shock wave has echoed the length and breadth of the whole land, and it has been heard particularly loud in the halls and classrooms, and partly because many of us have been searching for someone to blame. Many observers have interpreted Sputnik as a victory of the Russian schools over American schools. Here is a sampling of headlines. A race between schools. The Soviets challenge U.S. education. Soviet students call superior to American students. And one publication has purported to tell us the inside story of the breakdown of the American school system. One correspondent put it this way in his lead: behind the Soviet Sputnik there is a rocket, and behind the rocket there is advanced science and technology, and behind Soviet science and technology there are the Soviet schools. He could have added, and should have, behind the Soviet schools there is the Soviet government, regimenting, directing, molding minds into the shape prescribed by a tyrannical, ruthless state. I trust that the zealots who have suddenly decided that we should emulate the Soviet system of education will ponder that. Now, no one familiar with the facts will discount the progress made by Soviet schools in a very short time. But this does not mean that we should discard our system or even radically modify it. Improve it, yes, but hold it firm on the foundations of freedom and within the framework of democratic ideals and goals. Let's retain our strong citizen concern for the schools and what they offer. Let's not be backward about expressing our opinions and our suggestions, but let's keep our schools in the hands of professionals. To speak about taking school management out of the hands of the professionally trained teachers and administrators is as logical as asking plumbers to manage the medical schools. I have little patience with those who seem to think that we should adopt a caste system of education in which the brilliant students are strained off the top levels and sent to different schools, and the slow students directed into trade schools. As I think of my early days as a college teacher, and especially during the war, when the colleges were accepting almost any student who could read or write, I can recall scores of students who, according to every known standard of measurement, should never have been admitted at all. They should have failed before the end of the first semester, but somehow they didn't. Not all of them succeeded, you understand, but many of them merely needed time to find themselves. They didn't blossom until they came under the full influence of knowledge and teaching. I remember one case especially well. When I called on this prospective student at her home, I found that her father and mother had immigrated from a European country, that they could scarcely read or write. But somehow their imagination had been touched by the vision of a college education for their daughter, a plain, unimpressive girl with a mediocre high school record. As we discussed the daughter's plans, her father said several times, "In old country, this could not happen. America, she different, great." Today, wherever that illiterate steelworker's daughter is teaching, yes, she became a teacher, an attractive, poised, and competent one. I hope she is dramatizing for her students a remarkable success story, the story of American education. And this brings me to one criticism of our educational system. Students need to know more about the history of education in this country. They need to examine in high school the heritage of American education, to find the drama in it, and to understand the historic struggle between sincere, well-intentioned men on the one hand, who believed that education was for the few, and others on the opposite side who believed that mass education was a requisite of democracy, that it was indeed its very foundation. This does not deny the need for continuous appraisal and criticism. This should and does go on all the time. We must have more emphasis on science, but I believe we should teach more science and mathematics for a reason which has little relevance to Soviet competition. It is not news to you that we have developed an industrial civilization which is based largely on mass application of scientific principles. Note that I said we have developed this. And unless we learn more about science, you and I are going to be outsiders with the world going past us at a dizzy pace. We won't know what's going on. I don't know about you, but I'm so ignorant of science and mathematics and mechanics that I stand in awe of my wife's automatic washing machine. Then take cars, for example. A simple universal gadget, a car. But many of them today have 4 electric motors to move the windows up and down, a motor to move the front seat, a motor to run the radio antenna up and down, 2 motors to drive the windshield wipers, 8 motors in addition to the gasoline motor which drives the car. 9 motors in one car. Well, I wouldn't even know where to find them, let alone repair them. Here then are 2 simple and somewhat ridiculous examples of how science rules in our daily lives. I could go on to more shocking manifestations, such as a complete factory run by a few men sitting at a panel of push buttons, weather control, supersonic travel, tapping the basic energy of the sun, electronic brains, worldwide television, and so on. No matter where you turn, a scientist is there, studying, pondering, computing, implementing. Now, I think unless we want to turn into a society of passive knuckle brains staring into TV screens, we'd better use the minds we have to try to understand the age in which we're living. And this leads me to, logically, I hope, to the second question: who? The question I have formulated may seem a little fantastic to you. The question is, who will rule space? Last Saturday, as I sat in my study working on this talk, my 9-year-old son came into the room. "Daddy," he said, holding out a sheet of paper, "I've just written a poem. Would you read it?" "You read it to me," I said, trying to be tolerant of his interruption. The first two lines went this way: rockets, rockets everywhere, I wonder how it looks up there. There was much more, then a return to the final couplet: rockets, rockets everywhere, I wonder how it looks up there. Now this was serious business to him. And what a perfect illustration of what has happened to us. When I was 9 years old, I was looking up at the heavens and saying, twinkle, twinkle, little star. No matter how many problems it creates, the age of space is upon us. Many of you in this room will visit the moon, perhaps even other planets. And that frightens me a little. We have so many problems here that we haven't solved. But scientific advances do not wait. The most frightening aspect of all, however, is that you and I at this moment are witnessing a new facet of the Cold War. And this is page one news. If you remember your history, Balboa crossed Panama and claimed the Pacific Ocean for the King of Spain by right of discovery. And we haven't completely left this concept in our thinking. The first nation to send a manned spaceship to the moon not only will have entered a rather impressive claim on this subplanet, but also will have achieved a measure of control over all space. The 1944 Chicago Air Convention laid down the law that every state has complete and exclusive sovereignty over the airspace above its territory. But you see, here's another example of old concepts being outmoded by current events. No one can predict just how soon a manned space station or ship will go whirling into space, and maybe within a year, it may be 10 years. But it will be impossible under the present dimensions of our concepts to deal with the legal complications created by such developments. Just to nudge your imagination a bit more, let us suppose that a dispute should arise over whose spaceship actually touched down first on the moon. Or suppose two spaceships carrying precious data and cargo should collide. Who would arbitrate a peaceful dispute over damages? To carry this a step further, scientists predict that spaceships will be away from the Earth for months, perhaps years at a time. What if children were born on a spaceship or on the moon? What nationality would they be? These questions still seem amusing, but they are questions which someone must answer during the next half century. I wonder if we possess minds and attitudes which will adjust to the new dimensions of thinking which will be required. This leads naturally to the third question: when? When will we learn to get along with each other? An old Sanskrit proverb said, "Meet thy neighbor, talk with him, and there will be peace." And we believe this, or at least most of us want to believe it. That's why we're encouraged to learn that more than 150,000 students cross national boundaries to study in another country each year. That's why there's so much interest in the exchange of books, pictures, magazines, tape recordings, and movies. That's why our governments are encouraging culture exchanges of all kinds. That's why we think it's good that there is a growing number of tourists going from one country to another. If we can only get to meet our neighbors and talk with them, there will be peace, we hope. Alas, I must tell you that I believe that we are too optimistic. Peace can be created out of understanding, but true understanding is built by open hearts and searching minds, not with open purses or open tour folders. Last summer in Europe, I saw free-spending, loud-mouthed Americans destroying in a minute all the people-to-people understanding which might have been built up in a year of conscientious effort. Their idea of speaking the natives' language was to wave a dollar bill. Many persons in other lands have concluded that this is the only language that most of us speak. My idea of how to create a proper setting for international understanding was epitomized, on the other hand, by a lanky Texan and his wife who arrived without reservations at a small hotel in France. There was a lady at the desk, and she must have heard about the splendor of Texas, for when the man took off his big Texas hat and asked about a room, she answered very nervously and very apologetically, "Oui, monsieur, we have rooms, but they are not très modern. I'm afraid you would not like them." "Lady," the Texan said, "all we need in Texas is a straw stack and a couple of blankets." Whatever you have will be good enough for us. Of such is the kingdom of understanding. But it is not a one-way quest. Others have need of striving to understand us, too. The ideological cleavage which divides the world is not one which will yield to superficial conversation or to easy payment excursions. Conversation will help, as will anything which builds knowledge of the other fellow's background and his problem. But ours is a man-sized task which must be approached with the kind of genius and effort and money which went into the first atomic bomb. For solve this problem we must. The world cannot long endure the present peace by terror or by deterrent force, a state in which two nuclear giants threaten each other week by week. Civilization cannot support two armed camps poised forever on the brink of nuclear catastrophe. We live in daily fear of some error, if not some actual evil intention, which could trigger a war to destroy mankind itself and the planet on which we live. When will we understand each other? I don't know, but I do know that it won't be until we try, and try with an earnestness surpassing all the efforts which have been exerted in the past. My fourth question is, where? Where are the new frontiers? Those of us whose forefathers came from England naturally have inherited a tendency to search for new frontiers, for new adventure, and for a place for beginning again. When they came to dislike their government and the economic, social, and religious conditions surrounding them, some of them went to Holland. When discontent seized them there, they set out for a new continent. Our great-great-grandfathers who settled on the East Coast probably came westward just when the urge hit them. The New World has been characterized by expanding opportunities, by new frontiers, by great movements of population, and by bold adventures to challenge physical stamina and mental ingenuity. During the last half-century, we've seen the last homestead claimed, the virgin territories yield to the saw and the plow, and the quiet countryside transformed into noisy cities, and the shaded paths and streams turned into busy avenues of commerce. Until quite recently, I think, the average American youngster, reconciled to the passing of the frontier except on a few television shows, has been challenged by a dream of attacking the frontier of business. The dream has been to have a business of one's own, to enter the world of business on the proverbial shoestring and take your chances. This frontier still beckons to a few, and I hope it always will. I'm sure that many persons feel that the greatest frontier is space, that there may be a great exodus of daring souls to the moon, to Mars or Saturn, and I suppose there will be some of that. But I doubt that the great challenge to 20th century pioneers will be, go to the moon, young man, go to the moon. There's so much at stake here that I doubt that we can escape it, or that we want to. An American big game hunter in Africa was getting close to his prey when, to his chagrin, his hard-pressed native guide suddenly sat down to rest in the shade. He protested to no avail. He threatened, pleaded, bribed, but the guide sat fanning in the shade. But why, he implored the English-speaking leader, must you stop now? The native answered with a wry smile. Men say they have hurried so fast their bodies have run off and left their souls. Must wait for souls to catch up. Our breathless quest for wealth, products, gadgets, influence, and power has taken our bodies far into the jungle. Now we must wait for our souls to catch up. And I am saying now that here is the new frontier for you and for me, the frontier of the mind, and of the heart, and of the soul. In a recent issue of one of our greatest magazines, an important series of articles was introduced with almost a full page of 12-point type. The first paragraph of this introduction is worth repeating, I think. Perhaps never before in its long history has the Saturday Evening Post undertaken so ambitious a project as the one we are launching with the article which opens on the following 2 pages. We call this new series Adventures of the Mind, because creative thinking can be high adventure. Adventures of the mind, high adventure. This is and always has been the ever-present, ever-beckoning frontier. But the human personality, this spark of the divine, has only begun to skirt the brambles of the forest. A full and rich adventure with the mind will take us into the valleys and up to the mountains of human to human and human to God relationships which have hardly been probed. The challenge to use this adventure to create the good life for the community of mankind is a gigantic one, and I suppose we shall not easily accept it. But this is the new frontier. The fifth question is what? What is the price of freedom? A pat answer for us is eternal vigilance. But will eternal vigilance buy freedom for the Indonesian, the Algerian, the Hungarian, the Chinese, a long list of others? No, it is not quite that simple for most of the world. And this illustrates the fact that freedom has many meanings in the context of the 20th century, and that there is not a great deal of it, as we know it, in the world. But freedom is still a magic word. To millions who do not have it and want it desperately, it is a bright hope. To those few who fear it, it is more terrible than death. To those who have it and cherish it and believe in it for all peoples, freedom is the foundation of human dignity and the framework for peace and plenty. I cannot tell you the price of freedom. One is hardly conscious of the values of things that he has never lost, never been without. I've not lost my freedom, but I know a few persons who have, and I can tell you a little something about the kind of people who can have their freedom taken away. Several years ago, a lady from Europe came with her family to this country. The family had been fortunate. They had eaten regularly. They had not been injured during the war. They did not feel the lash of the whip or the searing heat of the incendiary bombs or the calculated fires of Dachau. In time, the family settled into the pleasant routine of living in this country. The mother obtained a position in a large Midwestern department store. Her background and her easy adjustment to American life excited some interest among her co-workers, and the editor of the company publication decided to interview her. After the usual questions, the editor asked this final question. Now, Mrs. M., of all the things you have seen and done in America, what has impressed you most? As the editor waited for her answer, she wondered what it would be. Would the most impressive thing be the skyscrapers in New York City, the magic of television, the abundance of goods on the store shelves, the beautiful automobiles in every driveway, or what? Finally, the answer came, simple and firm. The thing that has impressed me most about this country is that when there's a knock on my door, I'm not afraid to answer it. This lady could tell you about the price of freedom, and I must tell you about another lady who understood the price of freedom and paid it in full. She was a Hungarian mother who, with her husband and small son, were among the thousands who walked, ran, and clawed their way out of Hungary toward neutral territory. A man I know was standing on the border during this particular day and helped minister as best he could to the stream of refugees pouring out of this unhappy land. He saw them coming on the run, the man carrying their small son and the mother, heavy with child, not quite able to keep up. She didn't make it. The machine guns found one target, but the father and son got across. I imagine that father and son could tell you about the price of freedom. Now, I should like to tell you the story of three small boys who, in a way, represent the kind of people who could lose their freedom without ever understanding its value. Or at least, shall we say, this story has some of the makings. It happened in Chicago along a railroad right-of-way. These three boys ventured into this area to play, as boys will, where they were discovered by a railroad policeman. He warned them that they were not allowed to play in this area, accepted in good spirits by the boys. In the course of the conversation, however, the policeman discovered that one of the boys had a sack of candy in his pocket. His suspicions were aroused, and he accused the boys of stealing the candy. The The boy with the candy denied this and proudly pulled some change from his pocket. "I bought the candy, sir," he said, "and I have more money to buy more candy if I want it." By this time, the policeman was sure they were all delinquents, and he marched them off to the nearby candy store to prove his accusation. When they reached the store, the policeman was somewhat deflated to hear the boy's story confirmed by the proprietor. They had bought the candy with money earned by one of the boys. I know this is not a very dramatic story compared to the others, but I hope you can sense some of the allegorical overtones in this story as well as its literal meaning. I tell it to illustrate a growing trend to regard all breakers of the law as guilty until proven innocent. But even more alarming to me is the fact that these boys in this story thought it perfectly natural and logical that they must prove their innocence, and that possession of the candy was sufficient evidence that they had stolen it. I must add that these boys had never been in any kind of trouble before. Is it possible that these boys had seen too many television shows? That the badge and the uniform have taken on a new and greater and more symbolic meaning? Freedom means many things, but if it means anything at all, it means equality under the law and the basic right to be proven guilty. We must have respect for the law, yes, by all means, and respect for the people who enforce it fairly. But if freedom is to mean anything, it means that all arms of the government, local, state, national, are servants of the people. Respect for government, yes, but always servant of the people, subject to their recall, responsive to their wishes, and above all, and this is where you as potential journalists are vitally concerned, above all, sensitive to their right to know. What's the price of freedom? This is one area in which there are no bargain sales. No matter how high the price goes, freedom is worth all it may cost. And now for the last of our 5 W's, the why. If you're wondering why, then take comfort from the fact that other audiences before you have endured long addresses and wondered why too. I hope you'll not think that my last question is too philosophical for a banner headline. I promised at the outset that our 6 questions were page 1 topics, and I believe this one is too. I believe it is buried deep near the heart of a big story which runs on page 1 day after day. More than that, when I was teaching in college, I discovered that it was an urgent topic of discussion. From the time we were old enough to make thoughts and sounds, we carry on our lips day after day the question, why? Why are we here? Sometimes in the evening I listen to the Moscow radio. It's interesting and enlightening and very often amusing to hear their desperate propaganda attempts. Their idea of a favorite program is a long recital of statistics to prove how their steel and coal production, their car loadings, are about to surpass production in the United States. Then, of course, they made a great deal out of the Sputnik story. As I sat the other night listening, I couldn't help thinking, is this why we're here? To test who can forge more steel, make more television sets, and to see who can send the biggest ball into space? I hope not. Now, I'm not surprised that some Moscow leaders would say that such accomplishments performed for the glory of the state should be the ultimate in human achievements. But I hope not too many others accept this principle. I do not discount the necessity for dealing realistically with the issues which face us, but what a tragedy if we should lose our perspective, lose our faith in God and our reverence for life, and discard the values which undergird our heritage. Please don't think that the trend toward materialism originated across the seas and gets its momentum from somewhere outside. Not long ago, a rather well-known American, writing in retrospect, said, "I was a part of that strange race of people aptly described as spending their lives doing things they detest, to make money they don't want, to buy things they don't need, to impress people they don't like." What a picture of futility. What an answer to the question, why? Reminds me of the man and wife driving to Florida The wife was acting as navigator, consulting the map at regular intervals. After traveling a great distance, the wife suddenly announced that they were lost. "What's the difference?" the husband said. "We're making wonderful time." What does it profit us to span the ocean at the speed of sound and find that we have nothing to say to the people on the other side? Must we admit by default that our spiritual concept of man is not capable of demonstration, and that our noblest purpose is to build longer automobiles, shinier kitchens, taller buildings, and wider highways? A few years ago, several years before he died, Albert Einstein said, "A new type of thinking is essential if mankind is to survive and move to higher levels." On another occasion, he said that science could not produce happiness until man produced sense. What you and I need now are new dimensions of awareness, new insight into the news stories around us. We must have new dimensions of creativity and action, new dimensions of faith and understanding. I, for one, believe that we have the power within us to stretch our minds to fit the dimensions of the age which is unfolding. If we try and try in terms of a new age which will make demands the like of which we can barely imagine. Well, there they are, the 5 W's and the H's, the how, who, when, where, what, and why. They represent, I think, 6 colossal news stories searching for new dimensions among their readers, but most of all, among the writers who will handle them. Lest I have overdrawn their seriousness and impressed you unduly with the weight of the news, may I say that it was deliberately done. Perhaps our greatest peril is indifference to these questions and the easy conclusion that our answers don't count. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes was fond of telling the story about the time it was decided to have all the people in the world shout "boo" at the same time so that the voice of the world would be heard on the moon. When the moment came for this mighty shout, the people were all so eager to hear this great noise that each failed to contribute his boo. And this occasion passed as the most silent moment in all history.
Thank you, Mr. Jacobs, a great deal. And I hope that this talk is in vital speeches so that we can have it too, again and again. I believe that perhaps we had better adjourn and head for the cafeteria. Why don't we do that right now so we'll be in time for afternoon session?